There has never been a better time to revisit oppression, that most protean of antagonists, and what I like to call capitalism's henchmen. I quite like Neil Faulkner's definition of oppression from an article recently published by Mutiny as the systemic discrimination against a distinct social group on the basis of gender, race, religion, nationality, tribe, sexual orientation, disability, age, or any other real or imagined common characteristic. The fact is, oppression latches on to many facets of life and society and is never quite static. This is why, at a time when we see decreases in sexist attitudes in some areas of social life, for example, we simultaneously see increases in racism and classism, and vice versa. And although almost all oppressions within class society share the same substrate, it is not always the case that they necessarily speak to each other. I used to wonder why we cannot live in a society without oppression. Why, even when things are good, there is always a new group being pitched as the reason for society's ills and the thing upon which others can punch down on. As it transpires, oppression plays a critical role in the maintenance of capitalist reproduction. Here I want to distinguish between oppression within capitalist society from its close counterpart, exploitation. Whilst exploitation applies to all workers who have to trade in their labor, which is traded out of necessity in the marketplace at a value below what it's truly worth, the oppressed largely overlap with the exploited, being generally people isolated, reviled, and excluded from society's power structures. The oppressed serve as foremost as a buffer and a barrier that grants society and the working classes enough gratification to momentarily look away from their own suffering. And I say momentarily because society occasionally does wise up to the scapegoated role in which oppressed groups are placed, only to be handed a new group of oppressed people to hate. During my short time in Britain, I have watched the emphasis jump like an infection, from Black people and darker-skinned Asians, to gay people of Muslim faith, to the disabled, to Eastern Europeans, to travelers, to migrants, and to transgendered people, and back, most times encompassing all of these groups all at once. I belong to multiple oppressed groups simultaneously, so I suppose I have the luxury, shall we say, of witnessing the plight and the oppressed along different intersections up close, the gains, the losses, and the mistakes made along the way, but more importantly, the recycling of rhetoric by the establishment to isolate and oppress new groups of people with no noticeable loss of continuity, at times turning these self-same groups against themselves. I want to focus momentarily on how oppression has been shaped by the emerging COVID-19 crisis, specifically its impact on BAME people in Britain. I also want to focus on the changing facades of oppression and the lessons we can take from the fight and plight of the oppressed in becoming more conversant across different struggles. In late April this year, nearly a month after the country went into lockdown due to the coronavirus pandemic, I noted a curious phenomenon that, namely, the majority of doctors and nurses dying from the pandemic in the UK were from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, or BAME. I wanted to believe that this was something of a coincidence, despite the fact that BAME people only make up 20% of the NHS staff. It was later that month, on a phone conversation with my siblings across the pond, when they confirmed that BAME people were also dying disproportionately over there, if not in higher numbers. It wasn't just within the NHS that this pattern was replicated, but in society at large and all across the Anglosphere and beyond. As I tried to assess the situation more closely, I watched with bemusement as many media outlets and government outfits scratched their heads, coming up with every explanation and excuse, from vitamin D deficiency to behavioral tendencies, but few were willing to address the elephant in the room, which was systemic discrimination, structural inequalities, which carved a direct path to higher BAME mortality. As those formerly deemed unskilled and undesirable are rebranded as key workers, you'll note the overrepresentation of Black and minority ethnic workers in these groups. They are your Uber drivers, bus drivers, cleaners, orderlies and nurses, delivery drivers, post workers, shop clerks, and all of those who not only work in precarious occupations, but face heightened exposure to the virus due to their customer-facing jobs. The concentration of BAME people in these roles is not an accident, but an artifact of a sustained reproduction of hyper-exploited labor through legacies of colonialism, slavery in the US and the UK, and many other places. When the Windrush generation, now actively being deported from the UK, came over to this country, there were sanctioned jobs they were expected to do in order to help get the country back onto its feet, as they said. These low-paying service jobs were societally sanctioned roles for Black people, who in fact are still today punished when they step out of the allotted space for failing to know their place. I have joked with my partner on occasion about the level of discomfort and shock that my presence once inspired. When I was on the lift in conversation with a senior executive of an organization I worked for. My audience did not know who I was or what position I even held at the time, but my mere presence there as one of the only Black people at the company, let alone in that lift, left a palpable unease. I told my partner later that day that perhaps they'd have breathed easier and recognized me better had I had a broom in my hand. But it isn't funny. Recently, Edward Enninful, the first Black editor of Vogue magazine, was racially profiled in his place of work when a security guard in the building denied him entry, referring him instead to the service door of the building. As appalling as such setups are in the first place, having to employ poor doors in the 21st century, Enninful's plight is all too familiar. I too have been racially profiled and harassed simply for daring to enter spaces where I was thought not to belong. And this sort of informal racialized policing has harmful psychological impacts on people of color. And when adopted as a government policy, as seen with the Windrush scandal and the UK's hostile environment, can have devastating consequences. When adopted as a formal policing strategy, the results are even deadlier. A Black man walking into a shop is already deemed suspect. He is examined with closer attention. Any missteps can result in a fatal outcome. This was indeed the case of George Floyd, where a bounced check at a supermarket cost him his life, as he was publicly lynched in daylight by the police officer Derek Chauvin in the US. It means that a Black woman who has spent her years in service to the country, hoping for a peaceful retirement, was put through bureaucratic hell for 20 years due to the conscious destruction of her records by the UK Home Office. After years of service to the UK, Paulette Wilson was rewarded with, like so many in her shoes, an untimely death at the age of 64, with no compensation for the pain caused. Black and minority ethnic people often traverse the world with an extra layer of caution, conscious that their identity can be weaponized against them at any time. The knock-on impact of this further diminishment of control over their own fate in society, and an inability to fight multiple exploitations deriving both from the top and the bottom of society, leads to a cycle of poverty that is reproduced, which shows itself in terms of the high fidelity of Black and minority ethnics generation after generation having poor access to opportunities, living in poorer areas, and in effect exposed to the many ravages of society, including the virus or economic collapse. I mentioned the permutations of multitude of oppressed groups above, which capitalism uses to secure its reproduction through time. So why is it then that these groups don't often band together across boundaries to push back? Well, occasionally they do. And these are the punctuated groundswells of solidarity that we witness throughout history, which are occasional precisely because insofar as capital remains intact, such forces will always be dissipated in time. The American Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s was one such example, where we saw solidarity across racial lines as Black-led fights for equality and freedom from oppression were joined by white allies pushing towards the same aim. Earlier this year in May, a similar group of diverse people took to the streets of America and the UK, making the same demands for Black lives as their foremothers and forefathers nearly 60 years later. So what happened and how did we end up here again? During the Thatcher years, a group of LGBT people joined forces to support striking miners, raising money for the mining families that had been impacted by Thatcher's devastating policies. And this was in turn reciprocated in the miners' organization's support for LGBT groups. Gay rights have progressed further within the 21st century, yet today, transgender people are fighting for recognition and the self-same rights that we thought were won decades ago. So what happened, and how did we end up here again? The answer is not simple or straightforward, and it's not that people from different oppressed groups cannot see their plight in other people's struggles, or that the allies of the oppressed cannot recognize equivalencies across different struggles. But the ruling class's interest, that of capital, is to see that groups are divided and therefore rendered easier to control. Moreover, within these power structures, privileges, however tenuous, are apportioned to different groups and different segments of society, even those amongst the oppressed. This gives them a vested interest, even if tenuous, in preserving such privileges and acting as agents of the oppressors. In this way, we see different oppressed groups maintaining their own chains to preserve the place that they have secured within capitalist power structures. And so it was in America that white indentured workers who once saw their own fate in the enslaved Africans toiling in the fields were granted the gift of whiteness, so as to prevent them from joining with these groups, who were greater in number than their oppressors, and prevented them from banding together to fight their condition. Newly minted whites, as they were called, which incidentally excluded Italians and the Irish, were told that they were better than the Africans, who were identified as blacks. This extra leverage of whiteness, which sought to only marginal benefits amongst the most disenfranchised, often meant that even today, in today's USA, the most adamantly racist and defensive of white supremacy are the poorest of the working classes at times, who stand to gain the most from working together with other ethnic minorities to counteract the oppression that they face, and yet will not do so in order to preserve their whiteness. This pattern is replicated across time and space, drawing more groups into the realm of the oppressed, as they become surplus to capital's requirements. In the UK, this takes the form of extreme xenophobia and anti-migrant sentiments. These anti-migrant sentiments are not, in fact, applied universally, but often heavily target migrants from majority ethnic countries. They are pitched as the people coming over here and stealing jobs from the working classes and thereby lowering wages. Sadly, the rhetoric is present in both the UK's major political parties, the Labour and the Conservative Party. The narrative pushed here is that, but for migrants who have stolen jobs and depressed wages, the white working class person would have a better quality of life. This is obviously patently false, a fact that has not been borne out by the condition of the working class under capitalism across history. What happens when we see the gains and wins by the oppressed reversed and previous galvanized movements stymied is that capital is reasserting itself and its interests. Nowhere was this more proximate and evident in the UK than the results of the 2019 general election. This divide and conquer strategy is the bedrock of capitalist society. Groups of the oppressed are not selected at random either. They are often groups that are deemed to be a threat to capital's interests, either because they are surplus to requirements or they threaten the structures of capitalist reproduction, such as the patriarchal, home-owning working family. The discourse used to support the oppression of various groups always comes after the fact, but the aim is the preservation of capitalism, where exploiters are able to carry on without interruption and point to marginalized groups as a scapegoat should there be too much noise or any movements to stop their exploitation. And in this way, we keep ending up back where we are in the same position. I am not here proposing that different groups in society lack legitimate grievances due to long-standing historical injustices. I am arguing, however, that in this case, it has often been weaponized by capitalism to further divide the working classes. And where this is not the case, new grievances are forged, such as what is evident in the race relations in the United States, to ensure that long-lasting divisions exist between the different races, where it might have been ephemeral or transient outside of capitalism. It is in recognizing that oppression is used to shore up capitalist reproduction that movements looking to tackle it can do so more effectively. Not in pursuing just one specific instance of oppression, but the form within which the oppression is subsumed. It isn't enough to support gay rights while fanning the flames of racist rhetoric. It's not enough to support women's rights whilst peddling Islamophobia or anti-Semitism. This whack-a-mole approach to oppression just doesn't work. This isn't because oppressions are the same, but because they are supported by the same power structures and serve a similar function. We need to address the individual instances of oppression as well as its form, or we will always be right back where we started each time. I want to end this segment on oppression by focusing on one that is fast emerging and gaining stronger momentum in the UK than almost anywhere else in the Anglosphere. I want to speak about the emerging oppression of transgender people and the failure of many, even on the left, to recognize and tackle this phenomenon. As trans people now fight for the right to be recognized, it is clear that not everyone within the LGBT umbrella was allowed even the spoils of the fight for equality. Trans people are now targeted for similar reasons that gay people and lesbian people were targeted in the foregoing decades. They are deemed to pose a threat to capitalist reproduction because their very existence challenges gender normative, so-called traditional family units. I have now seen everything right from the grotesque bathroom arguments to won't somebody think of the children arguments of the anti-gay 1980s movements being refashioned and redeployed against trans people. We have been here before. Trans people have not benefited from all of the rights and gains by the LGBT plus struggle, and the moral panic that inspired people back in the 80s is now being rebirthed and accepted. It therefore astonishes me that those who are familiar with this rhetoric and have fought ardently for gay rights are now turning around to support the false rhetoric when used against trans equality. As a minority, I don't have the luxury of forgetting the rhetoric that has been used against me or the parallels that they bear to that used against other oppressed minorities. As those concerned about oppression, we must now discuss the form and must learn how to spot the instances as well. We do not do this by only pointing to when tensions boil over, such as in the case of BLM, following centuries of Black struggle, or when for the continued struggle of women for equality, or that of gay people for equality and acceptance. We must do so at a stage when the struggle is new as well, such as when trans people are experiencing a renewed oppression in response to new assertions for their liberation. We recognize the form and need to apply it to each instance. As Marx aptly noted, labor cannot emancipate itself in the white skin when in the black skin it is branded. I will add to this and say that we cannot eradicate oppression in one corner of society if we allow capital to simply replace one group with another. Thank you.